I've often wondered what would happen if we hammer the Venn diagram of overlapping creative fields into a circle. Game design is a field that excels at making a player's actions feel impactful. Writing, on the other hand, engages readers on an emotional level through tailored prose and interesting dialogue. Today we'll be taking a look at what systemic game design principles are and how to apply them to storytelling, with the aim to create a world that feels alive and reacts to the player's actions. So, what is systemic game design anyway? If you're working in game development, you might have heard this term thrown around before. I won't bother trying to define it in technical jargon. Instead, I'll jump straight into a concrete example. Let's say our game has a Molotov cocktail item. If the player throws it at something, it will set fire to whatever is touching it. In more traditional design, we would manually define what we can and can't set fire to. For example, we define that, yes, we should be able to set a police car on fire. But then, what happens when you throw it into a lake? We want to remove the Molotov cocktail and it doesn't set fire to anything. Then, a programmer would write code to destroy the Molotov cocktail when it touches a lake, and other code to allow a police car to burn when the Molotov cocktail touches it. Both from a design and a programming perspective, the police car is an object that has the functionality of a vehicle. It needs code for driving around, putting on the sirens, collision, that kind of stuff. But now we have to add that it gets set on fire when coming into contact with a Molotov cocktail. That's what I mean by a manual definition. In systemic game design, we would create a separate system that takes care of all of those manual definitions for us. That system is completely independent and will have no notion of anything outside of its responsibility, which in our case is setting things on fire. We create a flammable flag and a fire flag. The programmer writes a system that says that whenever something with the flammable flag touches something with the fire flag, it removes the flammable flag from it and attaches a fire flag instead. Now, note that I use the word flag here to mean any method of designating an object. Depending on your field or project, flag can be substituted for tag, or label, or component, or whatever you might have to designate that kind of object. So, for now, let's attach the flammable flag to the police car. After that, we attach a fire flag to the Molotov cocktail. Just for fun, let's attach a flammable flag to all the trees in our game as well. Now, when you throw a Molotov cocktail on a police car, it will be set on fire, like before. However, any trees touching the police car will also be set on fire, and so will any other trees adjacent to those. We suddenly have a forest fire on our hands. Imagine if the police car is driving around while on fire. That would cause complete mayhem. But what about the interaction with the lake we had in our traditional design example? We create another system that says when something with the wet flag touches something with the fire flag, it removes the fire flag completely. We then attach the wet flag to the lake. I think there's a whole scientific discussion about if water is actually wet or not, but I am not gonna get into that. Then, when the Molotov cocktail touches the lake and its fire flag is removed, it doesn't set fire to anything. Note that this particular wet system doesn't know anything about the flammable flag, because that is outside of its responsibility. We can also add a wet flag to a new item, the bucket. When you throw a bucket on anything that's on fire, it will automatically extinguish it, without manually defining every individual interaction between buckets, trees, police cars, lakes, and Molotov cocktails. Hopefully, the possibilities of this kind of design is already sparking your imagination a little bit. Systemic games use multiple of these systems to create a reactive playground for the player to interact with. A somewhat recent example of this is The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild series, I guess now, where a big part of learning the game as a player is experimenting to see how the world's systems react to your input. Did you know, for example, that you can cook an egg by tossing it in a hot spring? I invite you to figure out what flags and systems might allow that to happen. But how can systemic design enhance storytelling? Systems like these can generate entire worlds too, like in Dwarf Fortress. Even though Dwarf Fortress has no story in the traditional sense, Simply interacting with its reactive world causes a sequence of events that you, as a player, can interpret as a story. There's even a website dedicated to stories like that, link in the description, where people come up with entire Shakespearean plays based on what is essentially a bunch of systems just reacting to each other. That's called emergent stories. But that's a subject for another day. A future video maybe? Let me know in the comments. Apart from generating entire worlds, I found that taking these systemic principles and applying them to game narratives can offer a more immersive experience to players as well. Especially in large open world games with many NPCs, dialogue can get repetitive quickly unless you write loads of dialogue script by hand. So let's say we're making an open world game with hundreds, maybe thousands of NPCs. Realistically, we won't have the time to give all of them unique and interesting dialogue. So we're resorting to writing some shared generic interaction. At some point though, the player will tire of seeing "Greetings, traveler" for the 100th time. It makes the world feel robotic, as though all characters are animatronics waiting to deliver their line. "Greetings, traveler." "Greetings, oh, greetings, traveler." "Greetings, traveler." "Greetings, traveler." Yeah, so we want to introduce some reactivity to the world so that characters can respond to the player's actions and in-world achievements. Let's say the player picks up a relic, some ancient magical item called the magnetic egg, for example. And we want characters to give some information about that relic, but if all characters were to react to it, it would feel kind of like animatronics again, right? In a traditional branching narrative game, we would create a unique character. Let's call her Prequildo. We would then write her a set of responses based on whether the player is carrying a relic or not. It would look something like this. "Greetings, traveler." Oh, hi there. If the player has the relic, "Ah, yes. You have brought me the infamous magnetic egg, fabled for its magic proteins and ability to stick to metal surfaces, yada yada yada." And then if the player does not have the relic, "Please come by whenever you found a relic for me to study." But that's just one character in a sea of hundreds. The chance that the player will stumble into Prequildo while carrying a relic is tiny. So this interaction will likely not even see the light of day. If we take a more systemic approach, instead of defining this dialogue specifically for Prequildo, we would create a flag called Antiquarian. Antiquarian?
Antiquarian.
Antiquarian. In this case, an antiquarian would be someone that has knowledge of old things, including relics. Then we can create an independent system that checks if a character with the player flag is interacting with a character with the antiquarian flag. If they are, check if the player has a relic. And if they do, add that dialogue to the current interaction. Then we attach the antiquarian flag to, 20 NPCs in the world, and suddenly the player has a 1/5 chance running into this interaction. Don't quote me on the maths. Okay, but then, how do we make this repetitive interaction feel more unique? If the player encounters the relic interaction multiple times, they will see through the facade, and we're back to feeling robotic, even though it's a reactive event. Now we're going to discuss a few tricks to help with that. The first trick is artificial scarcity. It's simple, you just remove the interaction from the game completely after a player reads it for the first time. As a player, if you read a piece of script that reacts to something you've done, then never see it again, it will feel more like a uniquely tailored event, which creates the impression of having a lot of uniquely tailored dialogue specifically for you as a player. There are smart ways to remove, replace, and add interactions to a pool of potential encounters so that you can recycle the content you've written. But it can get a little complex. Perhaps I'll dedicate an entire video to this later, I'm not sure yet. The second trick is hiding the system. Never let the player in on the secret. If you reveal any information to the player that might tip them off about how the system works, instead, try to see it as an opportunity to make your narrative more reactive. Let's say if the player picks up the relic, they receive a quest. The quest reads something like, find out more about the relic, with the objective of bring the relic to an antiquarian. You then mark all the antiquarians on the map and the player chooses the one that's nearest. The problem with that is players will figure out that the whole antiquarian system is generic and not unique. Instead, what we can do is see if the player has already met an antiquarian in a systemic way. We can make a system that adds a new flag called met to characters that the player has interacted with before. Then we go through all the characters with the met flag and the antiquarian flag and fetch the name of the first character that satisfies those conditions. In this case, it brings up Prequildo. This way we can replace the objective bring the relic to an antiquarian with maybe Prequildo knows something about the relic. Not only does the game now react to the player having met Prequildo, but it creates an opportunity for the player to revisit a character they already know and potentially build up a bit of a relationship. Alternatively, if the player runs into another antiquarian by coincidence, we can check the met flag to add some more reactivity as well. That would look something like this. Greetings, traveler. If the player has a relic and the antiquarian does not have the met flag. Is that a relic you have there? I'm like super into relics. Here, let me see. And then it checks if the player has the magnetic egg, and it would go something like, ah yes, the infamous magnetic egg, fabled for its magic proteins, yada yada yada, you know the rest. That's fun! We have created the possibility for a little player story where the player first meets Prequildo, then finds the relic, tries to head back to Prequildo, and incidentally encounters another character that knows about relics. So now they've met two antiquarians without necessarily feeling like they've been railroaded into going to Prequildo, and without showing the system behind the antiquarian flag. Of course, right now it's still incredibly simplistic, but adding more of these systems grows the possibility for a player story that feels reactive and unique to their playthrough. You could probably already imagine creating other systems like this for your game. Faction, reputation, character personalities, religions, laws, the list goes on. So there we are. Applying these systemic game design principles to your writing nets you the efficiency of writing generic dialogue while also adding reactivity to your world that makes it feel more unique than it actually is. That, in turn, creates more possibilities for a player to experience a story unique to their choices. This way of writing is especially useful for games with loads of content and a lot of interaction from the player, like open world sandbox games. The downside, of course, is that recycling generic dialogue might suppress an individual character's voice and personality. I would not recommend relying too much on these systems for games with a small number of complex characters with strong, iconic personalities. And that about wraps it up for this week's subject. First off, thanks for watching. If you wonder if I have something to say on a topic you're particularly interested in, let me know in the comments down below. If you want to stay up to date with new to narrative videos in the future, don't forget to subscribe. That's it, I think. Thanks for watching again. Okay, bye.